In the last 2 hours, Cuba crash airline under scrutiny over past safety concerns. In the last 4 hours, Boeing to join Mexico in probe of deadly Cuba plane crash. More than 100 are feared dead in jetliner crash in Cuba cockpit. Voice recorder recovered from aircraft crash site in Cuba. Lithuanian President, PM extend condolences over plane crash in Cuba. In the last 6 hours, past safety concerns over Cuba air crash. Charter firm Lukashenko offers condolences to Cuba over aircraft crash victims. 33 corpses ID'd in Cuba plane crash. In the last 8 hours, Cuba plane crash. 20 evangelical pastors among the 110 dead. Cuba begins to bury its dead as questions raised over plane crash earlier today. Condolences to Cuba over plane crash. Cuba identifies 20 victims of fatal plane crash yesterday. Canadian vacationers stranded in Cuba following plane crash. Charter company in Cuba plane crash was subject of safety complaints. Cuba mourns after airliner crash leaves more than 100 dead. Cuba begins to bury its dead from airline disaster. Worrying connection between Cuba air disaster and Tigres UNL. Cuba identifies 15 victims of Friday's plane crash. Mexican charter firm in Cuba plane crash subject of 2 safety complaints. Survivors of Cuba plane crash still in critical condition. 20 fatal victims of plane crash in Cuba. Identified victims of Cuba plane crash include sushi-making co-pilot, Nazarene Pastors company in Cuba plane crash had safety issues. Plane that crashed in Cuba had maintenance problems. Company in Cuba plane crash had received serious safety complaints. Opinion in Cuba, a time of tragedy, and for transparency no Bulgarians reported among casualties of Cuba plane crash. Cuba plane company had safety worries. Cuba in mourning after deadliest air crash in nearly 30 years. Cuba plane crash safety complaint claims 20 priests among 100 killed in Cuba plane crash. Cuba mourns 107 victims of State Airways plane crash. Company that leased plane in Cuba crash to be audited. Black box retrieved at site of Cuba plane crash. Plane crash in Cuba, rescuers find black box. PNP mourns with people of Cuba. JA reaches out to Cuba following plane crash. Company in Cuba plane crash had received safety complaints. Cuba plane crash leaves 110 dead, 3 injured. Officials say Cuba plane crash update. 110 died in plane crash, 3 survivors critical. Cuba plane crash leaves 110 dead, 3 injured. Official says video. Cuba in mourning after the worst plane crash since 1989. Deadly crash spotlights Cuba Airlines woes. Officials say company in Cuba airliner crash had safety complaints. Iran sympathizes with Cuba over plane crash. Boeing 737 crash in Cuba kills 110 in the last 7 days. 110 killed in plane crash in Cuba, 3 survivors critical. Cuba in mourning after jet crash. 110 confirmed dead. Cuba confirms 110 killed in country's deadliest plane crash since 1989. Cuba, 110 confirmed dead in plane crash as black box found. Update. Black box found in Cuba plane crash. Officials say company in Cuba crash had safety complaints. Cuba, 110 died in plane crash. 3 survivors critical. Cuba confirms 110 dead in plane crash. State-run media. Cuba confirms 110 dead in plane crash. State-run media. 20 priests among dead in Cuba plane crash. Boeing 737 crash. Cuba mourns 110 victims. 110 confirms dead in Cuba Boeing 737 plane crash. Cuba, 3 airliner crash survivors critical. Flight recorder located. Cuba, 3 survivors critical after crash of jet carrying 110. 3 survivors critical after crash of Cuba jet carrying 110. Cuba plane crash. Black box recovered. Cuba plane crash. Black box recovered in good condition. Condolences. Foreign as Cuba mourns crash victims. Death toll in Cuba plane crash climbs to 113 as black box retrieved video. Investigation underway as Cuba mourns plane crash. 3 survivors of Cuba plane crash. In critical state, Cuba condoled over plane crash. Cuba in mourning after worst plane crash in nearly 30 years. The latest, Cuba, 3 survivors, critical, after